I love talking about this topic because I've been a sports fan. I've been a sports junkie all my life. My dad was a baseball player back in Cuba and from the moment that I was a little boy that he started raising me, he said, little boys play baseball. And I tried to play baseball, was not very good at it. So I feel very, very fortunate to have been able to channel my love for sports into writing. I guess it's turned out that I actually had a little bit of a talent in that area as opposed to what I was doing on the field or not doing on the field. I feel very humbled to be in this theater because I'm looking at a picture here of Tom Landry celebrating the Cowboys' victory in Super Bowl VI against, of course, my hometown team, the Miami Dolphins. That was actually one of the first moments in my life where my heart was broken by sports. But I've come to realize that sports is much more than what happens on the field. Sport is an integral part of American life. Sport is a way for people to become American and to feel like they belong in the United States of America. And over the past 60 years or so, a lot of folks have written extensively about sports. And Jacques Barzon and his writing on, and I mean, obviously God's Country and Mine covers a lot of different things, but out of that particular book in 1954, comes one of the greatest quotes about the significance of sport in American life that I've ever run across. And in this particular quote, it encapsulates the notion of if you want to be an American, if you were born someplace else, if you are a first-generation person from someplace else, the son or the daughter of people who've come from someplace else, this is a way to tie yourself into American society. So Barzon talks specifically about baseball, but I would argue that the same can be said about just about any of the major American sports. And I mean, obviously here in Texas, you have, the passion for football runs pretty hot in this state, just like my home state of Florida. And I would argue that if you want to be successful, if you want to be part of, if you want to gain a certain amount of entry into American society, being successful in sport is a great way to do that. For several decades, lots of historians have written about individuals of diverse backgrounds and talked about how sport has helped them to become part of, gain greater acceptance in American society. And let me just give you guys, and I mean, honestly, I could talk about this for several hours. There is so much stuff out there, but just some of the books that I would recommend if you want to find a little bit more about ethnic minorities or racial minorities in sport. Peter Levin's book, Ellis Island to Ebbets Field, the idea of sport, primarily boxing and basketball, as a vehicle for Jewish Americans to get a certain amount of acceptance in American society. Gerald Gem's Pride, Profit, and Patriarchy is a wonderful book. There's a specific chapter in that book, chapter 4. I've gotten a ton of mileage out of this book. It's called The Multicultural Huddle. And it is about how as American football begins to develop, it comes out of the Ivy League, and you have these disciples of Walter Camp, and these folks are starting to move into different parts of the country. Well, eventually, this sport is getting into areas where you have Mexican Americans, where you have Native Americans, and how these individuals are utilizing the sport as a way, the sport of football, as a way to gain acceptance. One of the things that Gems talks about that I find particularly fascinating is he talks about how, at least early on in football, you begin to develop the sense of different people from different backgrounds are going to be playing different positions. So, for example, if any of you folks have read Marinus's wonderful book on Vince Lombardi, When Pride Still Mattered, Vince Lombardi was part of the fabled 7 blocks of granite at Fordham University in the 1930s. And if you were Italian, if you were Slavic, if you were Southern European, you were an offensive lineman, by golly. I remember when I was a kid in the early 1970s, I remember Kurt Gowdy talking about on NFL, on NBC, on NFL games, talking about, gee, I wonder if there will ever be a black quarterback in the NFL. You had this sense that different people were going to play different positions. Michael Lomax, Black Baseball Entrepreneurs, baseball for African Americans was not just about what happened on the field. The Negro Leagues were important, obviously, but it's also a business. It's also a mechanism for African Americans to be able to show pride, to demonstrate what they could do and challenge certain assumptions. Lawrence Baldassaro, Beyond DiMaggio, Italian Americans and baseball. By the way, Gerald Gems has also done a wonderful book called Sport and Italian Americans, so it's a little bit broader, obviously. But Italian Americans, what did Joe DiMaggio and all these other great early Italian American baseball players mean to the community? Sam Regalado, a good friend of mine, Nikkei Baseball, Japanese American players from immigration to internment to the major leagues. When Japanese Americans were interned in these various camps during World War II, Sam talks a little bit about how certain people would come up to these Japanese Americans and say, well, we're going to teach you how to play baseball, we're going to teach you how to play basketball, we're going to teach you how to play football. And of course, the punchline is, these folks were American, they just happened to be a Japanese background. So they knew all these different sports already. William Kashustas, Money Pitcher, Chief Bender, and the Tragedy of Indian Assimilation. There's a great amount of work that's been done on Native Americans and sport. There's a guy by the name of, his last name is King, I believe his first name is Richard King, teaches at Washington State, who has done an extensive amount of work on the history of Native American participation in various sports, but mostly in baseball. Well, when I was finishing up my doctoral dissertation at the University of Utah about over 20 years ago, seems like it was 10 minutes ago, but it was over 20 years ago, I always loved sports. I always loved sports history. And when I got to Texas Tech, I had the opportunity to meet Jim Harper. Dr. Harper was one of the first historians in this country to actually teach a class on baseball history. And I remember I ran into Dr. Harper, and we started talking a little bit about our mutual love for sports history. And Jim told me about this gentleman by the name of Bobby Cavazos, a legendary figure at Texas Tech University. I would argue he's actually, to a very great extent, helped to put Texas Tech into the Southwest Conference because of our very successful 1953 season. So Jim said, why don't you write about Bobby Cavazos? Why don't you reach out to Bobby Cavazos and the Cavazos family and see if you can do a paper or interview Bobby Cavazos? So I did. And of course, I got to meet Bobby Cavazos. I got to meet General Dick Cavazos. I got to meet President Laurel Cavazos, the former president of Texas Tech University. And when I got down to Kingsville, I began to do research on Bobby, and I was introduced to a family by the name of Lerma, the Lerma family. And E.C. Lerma is a gentleman whom I've written about, a legendary high school football coach in South Texas. And pretty soon the light bulb turned on, and I said, you know, there's a there. There's more than just Bobby Cavazos, and there's more than E.C. Lerma to write about. So that's how I began to develop my interest in Mexican Americans and Latinos in sport in general. Now let me just tell you very quickly. Mexican American history, which is what I was trained in, that's my doctoral dissertation, and my first book was on a very exciting topic, Mexican American Mormons in Utah. It's a real page turner. Okay, I have extra copies if anybody wants to buy some after my presentation. But I mean, I became immersed in Mexican American history, and several things struck me. It was about primarily groups, and it was about unions, and it was about mutual aid societies, and it was about a protest, and it was about church groups. And okay, those are important topics. We have to discuss those things. However, there are other aspects to life. And little by little, as I began to research the presence of these Mexican Americans in high school sports in Texas, I began to see they're playing softball. Mexican Americans are playing basketball. Mexican Americans are playing baseball. There are women's teams. Well, what about South Texas? What about El Paso? What about Laredo? There are great stories there. So More Than Just Peloteros was the first book that I published, and it's an edited collection, and we look at a variety of topics. I did a paper for that book on Bobby Cavazos and E.C. Lerma and the significance of these Mexican American athletes to their communities. How are they challenging certain assumptions about Mexican Americans? Then we went on and we did, Professor Regalado and I and a couple other individuals did a broader study called Latinos in U.S. Sport, A History of Isolation, Cultural Identity, and Acceptance. And we came across individuals who were playing in the National Football League in the 1920s. Ignacio Molinet, the first Latino to play in the National Football League in 1927, Cuban American. It was just astonishing how many people we ran into. This book that I did on Mike Torres, I got to tell you a real quick story about this. My wife is the perfect person. I've been married to her for 34 years. She has one fault. She is a Yankee fan. I have tried my darndest to break her of that evil habit, but I've not been successful, unfortunately. When we went to see Mike Torres, we got to Topeka. Mike's from Topeka, Kansas. And we got to Topeka. We were having lunch at a Mexican restaurant in the barrio, in the Oakland barrio where he's from. And the very first thing that Mike Torres did is he took off his 1977 Yankees World Series ring and he slipped it on my wife's finger. She says that is the greatest moment of her life. That didn't make me feel all that great, but you know, I can understand. But Mike, it's not just about what he does in the majors. It's not just about the fact that he's one of those unfortunate athletes who is defined by one moment. Bill Buckner. I don't remember the name of the cornerback for the New Orleans Saints who gave up that touchdown in the last second against the Vikings this last season. University of Utah guy, of course. But I mean, you have these individual athletes who are associated with just these absolutely horrific moments. Ralph Branca with Bobby Thompson. And that game Mike didn't lose that game. That wasn't a game-ending home run like Bobby Thompson's home run was. But Mike was pitching a great game. And unfortunately, the wind changed. Bucky Dent, I think, fouled the ball, if I remember correctly, fouled the ball off his ankle. And it took him a little while to get back in the batter's box. And Mike didn't keep loose. And all sorts of things just combined to bring about that tragic event for Red Sox fans. But it's much more than that. Mike grew up in the barrio in Topeka, Kansas. His father played for Mexican-American baseball teams throughout the Midwest. Mike played basketball for Mexican and Mexican-American basketball teams throughout the Midwest. There's an entire history there of softball, of baseball, of basketball. So these are interesting stories that a lot of folks really have not bothered to take a look at. Mentioned Bobby Cavazos, mentioned A.C. Lerma. I'm also going to talk a little bit about Donna High School in 1961, the only team from the Valley ever to win a state title in high school here in the state of Texas. And just to give you a sense of how much work there is out there. And see, the reason I put that up there, hitting them when they ain't, that was the motto, that was the mantra that my mentor back at the University of Utah always used to say to me and to my fellow graduate students. You got to hit them where they ain't. You've got to do something that someone hasn't done before, or you have to do something that reinterprets totally a particular story. Well, I've been fortunate enough to be able to find a really bountiful amount of material in stuff that no one had done before. A couple weeks ago, my co-author, Mario Longoria, and I just sent a manuscript on Latinos and football to our publisher. Hopefully it's going to be coming out by the end of the year. We thought, hey, this thing's going to be a couple hundred pages, 250 pages, something like that. Manuscript was 492 pages long. We managed to get in touch with people in California, in New Mexico, in Texas, in Florida, and in other states. The newer states, obviously, that story is a bit more recent. But Mexican Americans, Latinos have been playing football in New Mexico since the 1890s. California, 1900s. Texas, 19-teens. So, I mean, you've got a there, and we've been very fortunate to be able to dig some of that stuff out. So, just to give you a sense of how this story plays out in a few places. And I could have selected a whole bunch of different things, but of course, knowing that Chad is a proud Red Raider, I figured this would be a good way to lead off. Bobby Cavazos helped get Texas Tech into the Southwest Conference. Born on the King Ranch in 1931, his older brother, Lauro, wound up being president of Texas Tech University, and then the first Latino to serve in a presidential cabinet under President Reagan and the first President Bush as Secretary of Education. Bobby was a superb athlete, ran track, played basketball, played football, played at Kingsville High School, then at Tarleton Junior College back then. Comes to Texas Tech in 1951, has one really good season, then a bit of an off season, but his really great season was 1953. Texas Tech wound up, Chad, I don't know if you're going to believe it when I say this, man, 11-1, went to the Gator Bowl and kicked Auburn's butt, 35-13. Bobby Cavazos was the MVP of that game, almost 200 yards rushing and I think 3 touchdowns. Now, why is this significant? Well, I went into the pages of the Lubbock AJ, and I started digging because, I mean, again, remember, at this particular moment in time, there are no African Americans on campus. The first African American to play football at Texas Tech is, I think, 1969 or 1970. But there was always this talk about, well, Tech needs to be successful in order to be able to get out of the old border conference. Those of you who are familiar with that, the history of that, and into the big time with the Southwest Conference. And we need the right kind of boys or the right kind of boy to be able to get us into, well, who would have thought that one of the right kind of boys was a Mexican-American from Kingsville? And if you read anything on the history of the family, the Cavazos family is truly an astonishing collection of individuals. Lauro Sr. was the first Mexican-American foreman on the King Ranch, helped to develop the Santa Gertrudis breed. When he was told that his kids were going to have to go to the Mexican school in Kingsville, he basically went over to the administrative offices of the Kingsville school and he said, I don't think so. So the kids wound up going to the white school in Kingsville. Just an incredible family. Lauro Cavazos, as I said, very successful in education and in government. Richard Cavazos, the first, I believe, 4-star general of Latino background in the U.S. Army. I mean, just an astonishing family. And a lot of this ties into sports. Richard played football at Texas Tech. Part of what helped to get Lauro to go to Texas Tech was his undergraduate degree is from Iowa State, but one of his professors wound up going to Texas Tech. Richard was already playing football at Texas Tech, so Lauro decided to go pursue his graduate degrees at Texas Tech. So you have an individual of a background that in the 1950s is, to say the least, problematic, looked down upon in the state of Texas. And he's leading Texas Tech University to one of its most successful seasons ever. And again, I don't have time to get into it, but you can argue that that season was one of the things that really made Texas Tech much more attractive to the Southwest Conference so that they could come in. Everardo Carlos Lerma, what a fascinating individual. E.C. Lerma and his son John Lerma, between the two of them in Texas and in New Mexico, have almost 400 wins as high school coaches at various levels, various high school levels. E.C. Lerma was born in Bishop in 1915. By the time that he was 8 years old, both of his parents had died. There were, I think, 12 kids. The other 11 said, we're going to make sure that you get an education. And E.C. was the guy that they really funneled all their energy into, and they got him through high school. He was all district for the Kingsville High School Brahmas in 1933, got a scholarship offer from Texas Christian in 1934. Think about how unusual that is for a Mexican American to graduate from high school in Texas in 1934 is unique in and of itself. But for this guy to get a scholarship offer to play at TCU at that time is astonishing. He decided to stay close to home and went to A&I, which, as I'm sure you all know now, is A&M Kingsville. Becomes a head coach, graduates in 1938, moves to Benavides in Duval County, and it serves as an assistant coach for a couple of years. The head coach for Benavides High gets fired after 1939, and E.C. Lerma puts in a request to, hey, I've got experience. I want to be the head football coach. People actually asked him, can a Mexican do this? Do you have the intellectual capability to do this? And E.C. says, well, I guess I proved them wrong. I just combined all of these. Some of these are district titles, some of these are by-district titles, and there's a couple of regional titles there. But he won all those titles between 1942 and 1954, which is when he leaves. Not only that, he also coached basketball, and they won district titles there. He coached track, and they won district titles there. The idea here is the following. It's similar to what I said about Bobby Cavazos. you have a Mexican American leading a very important institution for this community, and he's becoming successful, and he's making our name known far and wide. How does this challenge some of the assumptions about Mexican Americans at that time? 1961 Donna Redskins. What an incredible story. Earl Scott is the head coach. When Earl Scott took the job at Donna, some of his friends and colleagues told him, you don't want to go to South Texas. South Texas is a coaching wasteland. Why is it a coaching wasteland? Because it's 80% Mexican American. And everybody knows those guys can't play football. Well, he took the chance. And in 60, they did fairly well. I think they won their district. If I remember correctly, I think they won their district in 1960. Many of the players on this team would actually leave the valley during the summer, and they would go and work with their families in the fields. The quarterback, Luz Pedraza, who wound up being the athletic director for Corpus Christi, he retired a few years ago, his family actually would travel to Alabama and then to Michigan to work. I don't remember what they picked in Alabama. I know that what they picked in Michigan was cherries. And one of the really cool stories that he told me was the following. The family was traveling from South Texas to Alabama. They were traveling through Biloxi. They were actually a little bit ahead of schedule. And Dad says, hey, look, there's a beach. Why don't we go out and take a quick swim? They get out of the car. They go into the beach. Not 5 minutes later, a couple of police officers show up and say, hey, this is a beach for whites only. And of course, the Pedrazas say, well, since 1943, Mexican Americans had been considered white in Texas, right? So we're white, we're from Texas, we're considered white. And the poor cops just could not get a grasp or couldn't get a handle on, here's another group that's not quite white, not quite black, so how do we deal with them? Very interesting story. Training for endurance. These kids ran everywhere. In addition to the work that they did in the fields, in addition to the work that they did for their families, Scott made them run everywhere. He said, they said that, you've had an end of the quarter, you run to the other end of the field. A lot of these kids would actually run track, would actually play basketball as far as to keep themselves conditioned to play football. Team started off 0-2. One of the teams that they lost to was Rio Grande City, which was being coached by Coach Lerma. They started off 0-2. When they made the playoffs, one of the coaches for one of their opponents walked over to Coach Scott and said, hey, can these Pepper Bellies play? After all, none of these guys are ever making it into the Southwest Conference. The final score in that game was, I think, 32-14. They went into the game against Quanah. Quanah had outscored opponents going into that championship game 483-56. They won the game. You can just Google 1961 Donna Redskins. There's actually a film on it. There's lots of really good stuff connected to that. But I got to leave you with this as far as this story. There were five Avila brothers who played in 60, 61, and 62. One of the gentlemen that I interviewed was one of the Avila brothers who played on this 61 team. Goes back to Donna every so often. A few years ago, he said he was in the post office, he was waiting in line, and this older gentleman comes up to him and says, hey, are you one of the Avila boys? And he says, yes, I am. And he says this older gentleman turned to his wife and said, and I'll say it for you in Spanish because I mean the effect I think is just wonderful. He says, mira viejita, este es uno de los niños Ávila que jugó con el equipo del 61 cuando les enseñamos a los gringos que nosotros también sabíamos jugar fútbol. I'll translate. Sweetheart, This is one of the Avila boys who played for the 61 team when we showed the gringos that we too knew how to play football. Great. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. This is just absolutely wonderful stuff. So there's just so much of this, so much of this. Now, in the book that I'm selling today, there's some stuff here that I think you will also be interested in. Los Héroes del Barrio. The 1949 Bowie Bears, first state champions in baseball in the state of Texas. Nemo Herrera was their head coach. Nemo Herrera is the only coach in the history of the state of Texas to win state titles in two separate sports at two separate schools. He won basketball titles at Sidney Lanier in San Antonio. His wife had some medical issues. They moved to San Antonio. He got the job to El Paso. He got the job at Bowie, and he won a state title in baseball over there. The only individual to have done that. They played in Odessa. They played in Lubbock. They ran into no dogs or Mexican allowed signs, not surprising. They defeated Austin High School in Austin for the state title. The headline in the paper the next day as the team left town was "Mexicans steal the title." There's been quite a bit of research done on sport and Mexican Americans in El Paso. There's a bustling scene. You've got football, you've got basketball. There are a couple of folks. There's a gentleman by the name of Charles Hill who has done a lot of research on high school football in El Paso. I've been in touch with him as part of putting together the book on Latinos in football, and I'm trying to develop a follow-up project in the El Paso area as far as football. Sports are more than recreational competition. It's fused to values of white dominant class. Paseños could benefit from sport, and again, it is exactly the same thing that these other historians argue in regards to high school football, high school sports and sports in general for these other ethnic minorities. It is a way to challenge some of the assumptions that the broader society has. This is I like to think that my books are good. I would argue that this is the best single book on Mexican Americans and sport out there. It's by a buddy of mine, Ignacio Garcia. He teaches at BYU. He went to Sidney Lanier, so he had access to all these players and all these families when Mexicans could play ball. Absolutely a wonderful, wonderful book. Under the direction of Nemo Herrera, the Bears become top contenders for Texas supremacy as well, held a respectable position and inspired pupils to succeed through tangible examples. Same thing as E.C. Lerma. One of the things that we've been able to do in this Latinos in Football book that's going to be coming out is we've managed to get in touch with a substantial number of Mexican American and Cuban American high school football coaches throughout the country, and their stories are absolutely fabulous. Social history reveals much, but sport for Mexican Americans continues to be fairly undocumented. I'm hoping to remedy that situation. That's part of what I'm doing here. So, what does this all mean? Well, I think that part of the reason why you have an institution like this, and part of the reason why you have institutions like the Baseball Hall of Fame or the Football Hall of Fame or the Basketball Hall of Fame is because, by golly, we love sports. Sports means something. And look, it's wonderful to enjoy what happens on the field, on the court, on the diamond. It's wonderful to enjoy that, but as we are seeing today, and I'm not going to touch this current controversy with a 10-foot pole, by golly, all right? But what I'm telling you is this is a really interesting moment in time to contemplate the significance of sport, because sport means more than just the final score. And as a fan of the Pittsburgh Pirates, I've come to realize that you have to look for other things outside of what happens in the field because, over the last 2 decades plus, things have not been particularly wonderful for me, unlike the Yankees. But I mean, so that's really the kernel that I want you guys to take away from. And I make this argument with the kids in my sports history class at Tech at the very beginning of the semester and at the very end of the semester. Athletic competition has been used to break down social and cultural barriers, discredit stereotypes, and facilitate assimilation. There's been a lot of work that's been done on African Americans, a little less so on Native Americans, a little less so on Jewish Americans, a little less so on other ethnic groups. Latinos are the largest minority group in the country today. So their story is happening now, but there's also a history here. One of the things that I talk about at the very end, at the conclusion of this Latinos and football book, is Latinos have now, over the last couple of decades or so, moved into areas that are, quote, new areas of concentration. I use the example of several communities in the state of Georgia. Everyone, hey, there's lots of people of Spanish surnames in California, in Texas, in New Mexico, in Florida. Absolutely. Tons of them. But what about Georgia? What about Kansas? What about Iowa? What about Nebraska? Those kids are beginning to go into the pipeline. In Georgia, there are a couple of teams that are 35% Latino. Mexican, Mexican-American, Guatemalan, Salvadoran, Honduran. There's jobs in these communities, poultry farms, poultry processing plants, manufacturing of some kind, transportation of some kind. These folks are going there, and their kids are not playing football. Is this going to make it possible for these kids, these young men and young women who are playing soccer, who are playing basketball, to assimilate and to become part of the broader community? Sport can be used by ethnic groups to preserve and extend in-group relationships that support ethnic identities and make it possible to effectively bridge the gap between the native culture and the dominant U.S. culture. I got to leave you guys with one last story, and this comes from Mike Torres's older brother, John Torres, aka Johnny Boy Torres. He is a legend in Mexican-American softball leagues throughout the Midwest. There are basketball leagues and there are softball leagues in various parts of the Midwest. Some of these leagues have been around 50, 60 years by this stage of the game. When these teams start, they are Mexican teams. What that means is these folks are either born in Mexico or they're Mexican American. All right, let's let 30, 40 years go by, and now we have an increased percentage of intermarriage taking place. Mike Torres's sister is married to someone whose last name is not Rodriguez or Sanchez or Perez. Is that particular kid, athlete, does he qualify to play in the Mexican League? Johnny Boy says the following, because this is a big issue in these leagues. There's a friend of mine, his name's Ben Chappelle. He teaches at University of Kansas, and he's doing a book specifically on these Mexican-American softball leagues. And part of what he has to deal with is, who do we let into, if your last name is Johnson and your mom is Mexican-American and your dad is Anglo, are you Mexican enough to be able to play in these leagues? Johnny Boy says the following: it's good that you guys are having to face these situations, because now you can understand better what we faced 40, 50 years ago when we wanted to play and nobody would let us play. I would say that that's part of why sport matters, and especially sport in Latinos, why it matters. We're so fortunate here in Texas. I'm so fortunate here in Texas because, by golly, there is a ton of material out there. More than just Peloteros, the book that I'm selling today, a second volume is about to come out. And we have just some awesome stuff in there. We've got an article on Mexican-American young women playing basketball in the Valley. We have an article about Mexican-American drag racers. Just awesome stuff. We have articles on Mexican-Americans playing basketball in Arizona. There's all these great stories that we associate with African Americans, Italian Americans, Native Americans. Those stories are here, just no one had ever bothered to take a look at them. I'm very glad, I'm very fortunate to have been able to hit them where they ain't. That's why we're here today. Thank you very much.